Um, all right. So, welcome everyone to our Supporting Young People with Difficult Emotions webinar. We are Trafford Thriving Education, which is a mental health support team in Trafford. I'm Shanaz and I'm presenting with my colleague Lou. So we'll just go through the session aims on the next slide. So the aims of the webinar today is to improve our understanding of emotional development in children, to learn how to support your child to talk about emotions, to identify strategies to support your child to emotionally regulate, and to identify how to support children with sensory difficulties as well. So when we are talking about emotional regulation, we're talking about our ability to manage our emotions in a healthy manner. So this looks like being able to calm yourself down when you feel upset, to adjust to changes and expectations, to handle frustrations without an outburst, and to be able to experience strong emotions without being overwhelmed by them. For younger children, this can be a bit more difficult, but we'll go on to speaking about how we can support our younger people to manage them in a better way.
Yeah, so thinking about the emotional development of children can be a good starting place. And like the emotional development sort of between 6 and 9 years old means that children can start to recognize some of the key emotions and they might be able to describe them as well. This varies hugely from child to child, I think it's worth saying. So if you're thinking about the Inside Out film, some of those really primary key emotions, they should be fairly familiar with, but they still may mislabel or misunderstand their emotions, and some might not be able to sort of describe those. And at that point, regulating and controlling those emotions is still very, very difficult. They start to learn as they're a bit older to describe those emotions better, to name them, and to have a bit more insight into what might trigger them and when they're feeling them. But again, it can take a lot longer in some young people, right up to adolescence and beyond, until they have the ability to sort of regulate and control their emotions. Or if they can't describe them accurately, what we tend to focus on is what they are doing. So how their behaviours are manifesting around these emotions, what their responses are, because behaviour can say a lot about what a young person is feeling. And up until adolescence and beyond, children may need support from adults and caregivers around them to help to manage their feelings. That's very normal. That is part of a caregiver's role. And some young people will need that more than others. And that goes right into adulthood sometimes as well.
Yeah, so you might be thinking, why do children react so quickly? So different parts of our brain develop at different times, and the first part to develop is kind of referred to as a survival brain. So this is part of the brain that allows us to sort of um, think about our sort of regulate emotions, memories, and survival instincts. So that kind of develops first, and then later on, the areas to that are kind of responsible for thinking and reason, they mature much later. So for younger children, because the survival brain is developing the earliest, it sort of can result in children reacting a bit more quickly. You might notice that they become more emotionally dysregulated more easily. And this is just due to their stage of brain development at the time. Um, and it's important to sort of think about how the sort of the fight, flight, and freeze responses come into this. So when the survival brain becomes overactive, and when you sort of notice your younger people becoming dysregulated, it might manifest in their behaviour as fight, flight, and freeze responses. So just to go through sort of a brief overview of them. So a fight response might look like shouting, or maybe your younger person might be a bit more physically aggressive. A flight response might be them avoiding certain situations or running away. And a freeze response might look like them being unsure what to do or being unable to act, or even hiding away. So we have a video on the next slide to just kind of go through that in a bit more detail.
Oops. Okay, so thinking more about difficult emotions, we know fight, flight, and freeze can trigger difficult emotions, behaviours, responses, and physical symptoms. And the other thing that can trigger those difficult reactions, difficult behaviours, or big emotional responses is being outside of our window of tolerance. So there's a little diagram here to sort of illustrate the point. But the idea of the window of tolerance is that we have different zones of arousal. And we go through different sort of levels of arousal throughout the day. So the window in the middle is where we can operate within a level of arousal that where we can still stay calm, we can still be engaged, alert, present, and sort of respond appropriately to day-to-day stresses. Above that, if we are overstimulated or overwhelmed, is a state of hyperarousal, and that zone of sort of arousal, shall we say, is often comes out as fight, flight, and freeze, big reactions, panic, angry outbursts, irritability, self-destructive and unhelpful behaviours. And then below the window of tolerance is hypoarousal, which is an understimulated state. That can also sometimes come from overwhelm if a young person goes into shutdown. It can be triggered by shame, guilt, depression, and it can sort of manifest as a sort of a numbness, a withdrawal, a sort of passivity. I think it's worth saying that we all have a different size window at which we can sort of tolerate levels of arousal. And there are some things that we can do about that, but we are sort of all naturally born with different sort of size windows. If a young person has experienced a lot of difficult life stresses, then it makes sense that their window of tolerance will be narrower because they will be swinging between fight, flight, and freeze a lot of the time, as Shanaz explained. And I think that sort of leads to them being in hypo or hyper arousal much more frequently than perhaps somebody else who hasn't had those difficult life stresses. Other young people that may have a narrower window of tolerance are young people who are neurodivergent. If they are already dealing with difficulties such as sensory sensitivities, social communication difficulties, or difficulties sort of switching attention, then that can result in a narrower window of tolerance as well, and being sort of hypo or hyper aroused more easily because they are adding more challenges onto what they're already dealing with. So things that can trigger us into different arousal states are just day-to-day events such as transitions, changes, times of day, meals, levels of sleep, relationship difficulties, transitioning in and out of school or work. And that can sort of, we will naturally go through like almost like a wave of hyper and hyper arousal throughout the day. But for those of us who have good emotional regulation, that will stay within the window of tolerance much more so than people who are struggling more with their emotions.
Yeah, so as Lou was saying, some young people do experience different like sensory difficulties, which can cause them to feel dysregulated. So for some younger people, if we try and keep them in the calm window all the time, it might not feel exciting for them. So if you try and sort of get them to do lots of calming activities, they might want to seek out more of the exciting and more stimulating activities, and this might show through their behavior. As such, children have a sort of a need to go between the calm windows and the alert windows back and forth. So they need to have access to a range of different alerting activities as well as a range of calming and soothing activities. So to support this, you might be able to sort of come up with something called a sensory diet or a sensory circuit. So this might look like planning alternating calming and alerting activities throughout the day. Um, so it's important to really think about what part of the day the young person might need a calming activity. So it might be that before they go to school or before they might go out to like a busy shopping area or something like that. So you might want to do something with them which might be soothing, like a bit of yoga, maybe blowing bubbles, or telling them to get have a warm bath, do some self-care. Um, and it's also important to think about when they might be needing more alerting activities. So this tends to be maybe before doing a bit more thinking tasks. So it might be before they do their homework or need to do something that requires a lot of concentration and focus. It might be helpful to plan with them about doing maybe more physical activity or maybe dancing or playing with their pet or something like that, which is a bit more alerting for them. So thinking about the times of day where your children's emotional sort of arousal levels will be at the highest, think about a calming activity, and then vice versa about having alerting activities in there. So this can support with regulation for the young person. So we've got some ideas here about what you might be able to do with your young person to support them with any sensory difficulties. So we've got smell and taste. So it might be suggesting, to smell some really strong smelling spices or using essential oils, blowing bubbles, or even eating frozen or warm foods, depending. And then we've also got movement. So this will be things like yoga, stretching, doing star jumps, maybe having a run around, doing a rocking chair as well. Then we've got vision. So a young person might prefer to be in the dark, and this might help them to regulate. We've also got looking at nature, lava lamps, doing dot to dots, exercises, things like that. Then we've got auditory strategies as well. So a young person might prefer whispering, or they might prefer louder sort of noises like banging on pots and pans, blowing a whistle, or listening to their favorite music. And then we've got touch and pressure. So it might be, giving them a strong squeeze, a little hug, massages, getting them to stroke their pet, and using a fidget spinner, which might help. So these strategies just support you in class and give ideas of what calming or alerting activities you could do.
Okay, so the image on this slide is an illustration of what we call a crisis curve. And a crisis curve is, I guess, just that charting that level of arousal that young people might feel before they hit a sort of a crisis point. And that might look like a meltdown, or it might look like a shutdown, depending on your young person and the situation. There are 3 stages of the crisis curve that we wanted to talk you through, and it's just quite helpful to sort of visualize it and think about what your young person might be experiencing and where you can intervene and what you can do. So the build-up stage is the amber stage on the left, when the young person's emotions are starting to escalate. It might be really obvious that's bubbling away for them, or it might feel like you might not be able to sense that very easily, and then the sort of crisis point comes out of the blue. The better you know your child and the more actively present you are with them, the easier it is to spot that build-up phase. At this point, you can sort of help and support by using some of the calming strategies or the sensory strategies that Shanaz mentioned on the previous slide. You might be able to use distraction or redirection, and if that's successful, then quite often you can head off a crisis at this stage and they won't go into the meltdown or shutdown. But it can be tricky, and for some young people, it can be a sort of a cumulative effect that sort of goes beneath the surface. So, for instance, if your young person seems to be managing their emotions really well in school, but actually what's happening is they're masking and sort of sitting on a lot of the difficulties that they're feeling, when they come home, you might start to see that bubbling. And if there's too much demand on them, or they can't have access to what they want, or they're not able to release that sort of or decompress in time, then you might then go into sort of a meltdown, shutdown stage. But if you can take some action at this stage to support them in the build-up, then you might actually not need that. That might not be the conclusion. Once they are aroused or escalated to the point they're in meltdown or shutdown, this is when the emotions have reached their peak. So during this point, it's really important to sort of keep everyone safe, because it can look like aggression, it can be destroying things, it can be self-harm, and it's very difficult and distressing to watch as a caregiver when a young person is in one of these states. If they're in shutdown or meltdown, it's really difficult to get through to them, to reason or rationalise with them, or even to give them instructions. And that's because if we go back to what Shanaz was talking about, our survival brain versus our thinking brain, when you're in a sort of a crisis, then your survival brain is very much taken over, and that is sort of putting you into a survival state. The thinking brain is sort of disconnected at that point, not completely, but it's almost like in a screensaver mode. And so getting a young person to think is just sort of overloading them even further, really, and they're sometimes just not able to do that. So keeping any instructions, statements, or anything that you have to say really sort of short and calm in that moment, regulating your own emotions in that moment, and just making sure everybody's safe. That's pretty much all you can do at that point. Distraction at that stage doesn't often work very well. You sort of have to ride it out and wait for it to pass. And that will then go into the recovery stage. That's when the emotions have started to come down again. The young person's survival brain has sort of started to bring the body out of survival mode, and the thinking brain is starting to come back online. At that point, it's really important to allow that young person time to continue to de-escalate and decompress following that crisis. It's very easy to think, oh, great, they're with us again, let's jump back in. But sometimes if you do that too early, then that can escalate into another crisis. And sometimes that crisis can be bigger depending on where they are in that recovery state. So really sort of keeping pressure and demand to a minimum at that stage is really important too.